We'll go to Bard College's Jonathan Becker. Next question. You've spoken about movements in different countries and Deva about the movement for Black Lives, but how about transnational movements and the linking of movements? How do we see the movement for Black Lives as a global movement? How about the resistance to rising authoritarianism, Poland, Hungary, the US, cooperate and learn and unite?
Well, I mean, for my part, the movement for Black Lives is a global movement. So, protests in defense of Black lives took place in more than 60 countries and on every continent except Antarctica. So it is a transnational movement already. And it was conceived that way on purpose, right? From 2015, one of the first things that the movement for Black Lives did, once it became the movement for Black Lives, was to send delegations to different parts of the world to sort of figure out what people were, people who were considered Black, right? A kind of global color line, how they were organizing, what their issues were, where the overlaps were, what the differences were. So delegations were sent to South Africa, Brazil, Australia, Palestine, to really sort of get an idea of how this movement could, be transnational, how perhaps this kind of communication and sharing of tactics, strategies, innovations, information, toolkits are huge in the movement, could happen. So that's what I would say. In terms of your sort of pro-democracy struggles that aren't necessarily related, and how could they make connections? I'm not sure. Perhaps Dr. Chenoweth will have more to say about that, about how folks in Hungary and Poland and Turkey, could what kind of connections could be made there.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the only thing that I'd add to what Professor Woodley has said so well is just that there are many movements now who have taken inspiration from the movement for Black Lives with regard to police brutality and the claims the population can make expressly about defunding or abolishing abusive police forces. Notably, one right now that's ongoing in Nigeria is the End SARS movement, which is explicitly seeing itself, I think, in solidarity with the movement for Black Lives and movements against the abuse of power by repressive agents of the state. That is linked, I think, to this second part of the question about movements that are fighting against authoritarianism. One of the patterns that is quite notable is that movements that start out, for example, calling for economic reforms or to protest a particular policy change like the removal of a food subsidy or something like that, often escalate into movements demanding the overthrow of a government or regime change or democracy when those initial protests are met with police brutality. So one common link between most of the movements that we're seeing all around the world today, whether they're in Hong Kong, India, the United States, Belarus, many in Nigeria, wherever we find these movements, one of the core claims is that they want justice for police brutality. And so I think that that is just one of the most commonly shared concerns around the world today, perhaps because of the nature of militarization of police forces worldwide, and the fact that militarized police forces seem themselves to be in solidarity with one another. So they are learning from one another, they are training together, and people around the world have now taken it upon themselves to begin to question and push back on that, seeing these as actually civil servants, public servants, not as repressive agents of the state that need to be held accountable as well. And then in terms of ways that these movements can connect and learn from one another, I mean, this is one of the biggest questions I think that's out there, because there is a very well documented global right wing, for example, evangelical groups, far right groups, and even ordinary kind of conservative groups have invested a lot into developing transnational agenda setting power and the ability to organize communities all over the world to push for more conservative policies and sort of public narratives and norms. and why the left hasn't been able to establish and sustain a similar transnational solidarity network in the past really 30 years is a big open question. But in the meantime, there is some really interesting developments around the expansion of groups of activists who are willing to train other activists from similar settings. So there are groups like Canvas, like Nonviolent International, like the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, RISE, even some groups affiliated with unarmed peacekeeping teams like Nonviolent Peace Force or the Christian peacemaker teams and international peace brigades and things like this. Are willing to offer trainings to people based on their own learnings from their own context about how to fight back against authoritarianism. But these movements and groups don't have a ton of resources behind them, not anywhere near the scale of what the sort of global right wing has been able to invest in its transnational work. And so I think that is going to be a major challenge, is like, where do you even convene these people? How do you start? How do you support their work? How do you make sure that they are connected with those who have the skill sets and know-how that they need?
I will say that I do think that people are thinking through those questions right now, right? That it has become clear that that's something that is necessary going forward, because so many of these problems are common globally. But I should also say that in the case of the right wing, they have invested a ton of resources in creating this international infrastructure, but that's also in part because religious institutions, which were not always considered right-wing, were kind of ceded to the right-wing ideologically in the middle of last century. And so there was already a ready network of institutions in which to organize people and that you could pour resources into, right? And on the left, unless the left is able to there are religious left movements, unless they're able to funnel resources through those institutions, are going to have to create their own institutions that are not pre-existing. And that's a pretty heavy lift, although it is one that people are seeking to undertake.